Today, we're going to dive into one of the most dramatic and powerful stories in the Bible, the rise and fall of Pharaoh, and how God used Moses to deliver his people from the bondage of Egypt. This story, found in the book of Exodus, is one of stubbornness, pride, divine power, and ultimately the triumph of God's will. We'll journey through each of the 10 devastating plagues that God sent upon Egypt as Pharaoh hardened his heart again and again. This is the story of how God not only delivered his people, but also demonstrated his sovereignty over all things. The bondage of Israel and God's call to Moses. The story begins with the Israelites in Egypt, a people who had once thrived in the land under Joseph's leadership, but were now enslaved by a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Pharaoh, threatened by the growing number of Israelites, feared that they would rise up and overthrow him, so he oppressed them with hard labor, turning their lives bitter with unrelenting cruelty. The people cried out to God for deliverance, and God heard their cries. God chose Moses, a man raised in Pharaoh's own household, but who had fled Egypt after killing an Egyptian in defense of a fellow Israelite. Moses was called at the burning bush, where God revealed his plan to rescue his people. Exodus 378 says, "The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians." Moses was reluctant at first, unsure of his ability to lead. But God promised to be with him every step of the way. With his brother Aaron by his side, Moses returned to Egypt to confront Pharaoh with a command from God, "Let my people go." The confrontation Pharaoh's hardened heart. Pharaoh's initial reaction to Moses was one of defiance. When Moses and Aaron stood before him and delivered God's message, "Let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness," Pharaoh's response was filled with pride and arrogance. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." Not only did Pharaoh refuse, but he also made life even harder for the Israelites by increasing their workload. Their cries grew louder, but Pharaoh's heart only grew more stubborn. However, this was only the beginning of what would become a spiritual showdown between Pharaoh and the God of Israel. The 10 plagues begins, and God's judgment unleashed. God began to reveal his power to Pharaoh and the people of Egypt through a series of 10 plagues, each one more severe than the last. These plagues were not just acts of divine wrath, but strategic blows against Egypt's gods and Pharaoh's hardened heart. The first plague, water turns to blood. God's first act of judgment was aimed at the lifeblood of Egypt, the Nile River. When Moses stretched his staff over the waters, they turned into blood. The river, once a source of life, became a source of death. Fish died, and the stench filled the land. The people had no clean water to drink. This plague targeted Hapi, the Egyptian god of the Nile, showing that the God of Israel held power over their most vital resource. Pharaoh's magicians replicated this on a small scale, and Pharaoh's heart remained hard. The second plague, frogs, overrun Egypt. Next, God sent a plague of frogs. Frogs were sacred in Egyptian culture, particularly associated with the goddess Hecate, who symbolized fertility. But now, they became a curse. Frogs covered the land, inside homes, beds, ovens, everywhere. Pharaoh begged Moses to ask God to remove the frogs, and God did. Yet as soon as relief came, Pharaoh's heart grew hard again, and he refused to let the Israelites go. The third plague, gnats and lice. Without warning, Aaron stretched out his staff, and the dust of the earth became gnats that tormented both people and animals alike. These tiny pests swarmed Egypt, a relentless attack on their comfort. Pharaoh's magicians could not replicate this plague and admitted, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh remained stubborn, refusing to relent. The fourth plague, swarms of flies. Swarms of flies came next. They invaded every corner of Egypt, spreading disease and misery. But this time, something changed. God made a distinction between the Egyptians and the Israelites. The region of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was untouched by the plague. Not a single fly crossed into their land, showing once again that God protected his people. Pharaoh, in desperation, attempted to negotiate, but when the flies were removed, he hardened his heart once again. The fifth plague, death of livestock. Then came the death of Egypt's livestock. Horses, camels, cattle, sheep were all struck down by a deadly plague. This was an attack on Egypt's economy and livelihood, yet once again, the Israelites' livestock was spared. Pharaoh sent men to check the situation in Goshen, confirming that none of the Israelite animals had been affected, but he still refused to let God's people go. The sixth plague, boils. Boils then broke out on the Egyptians and their animals. Painful sores covered their skin, and even Pharaoh's magicians couldn't stand before Moses, because they too were covered in boils. But despite the physical suffering, Pharaoh would not budge. His heart was too hard, too proud. The seventh plague, hailstorm of destruction. The seventh plague was a destructive hailstorm that ravaged Egypt. God gave Pharaoh a chance to avoid the coming disaster by instructing the Egyptians to bring their livestock and servants indoors. Some listened, fearing the power of the God of Israel, but many did not. The hailstorm tore through Egypt, destroying crops, homes, and even killing those left outside. In Goshen, the Israelites remained safe, untouched by the storm. Pharaoh once again pleaded for mercy, but as soon as the storm passed, his heart hardened again. The eighth plague, locusts. Locusts were next. They swarmed Egypt, devouring anything that remained after the hail. The land was left barren, stripped of all vegetation. Egypt's resources were being systematically destroyed. Pharaoh once again promised to let the Israelites go, but as soon as Moses prayed for the locusts to leave, Pharaoh went back on his word. The ninth plague, darkness. Then came a darkness that could be felt. For 3 days, Egypt was plunged into a thick, impenetrable darkness. No one could see anything or move. It was as if the very soul of Egypt was covered in a veil of despair. Yet, in the homes of the Israelites, there was light. Pharaoh offered yet another compromise, but Moses refused to accept anything less than total freedom. Pharaoh's fury reached its peak, and he threatened Moses, declaring that the next time he saw him, Moses would die. The 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. The final, most devastating plague came, the death of the firstborn. God gave Moses instructions for the Israelites. They were to slaughter a lamb and mark their doorposts with its blood. That night, the angel of death passed through Egypt, and in every home, not marked by the blood of the lamb, the firstborn's son died. The cries of Egypt were like nothing ever heard before. Even Pharaoh's own son was taken. This was the breaking point. Pharaoh, consumed by grief and fear, finally relented. He called Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night and told them to take the Israelites and leave Egypt. After years of oppression and bondage, God's people were free. This story is more than just a record of plagues and suffering. It's a testament to God's power, His justice, and His love for His people. Each plague was a demonstration that no earthly ruler, no false god could stand against the true God. Pharaoh's pride led to the downfall of Egypt, but through it all, God was working to deliver His people. Even in the darkest moments, God's light was always present. Thank you for joining me today as we reflected on the rise and fall of Pharaoh and the incredible story of Moses leading God's people to freedom. Stay tuned for part 2 of Moses' most powerful and inspiring story. This story reminds us that even in our most stubborn resistance, God's will is unshakable. May we never forget the lengths He will go to rescue those He loves. May God guide you and bless you with success in every step you take. Trust in His wisdom and may you find peace and prosperity in all areas of your life.